The movie begins with an old lady crocheting in her comfy chair, when she hears something skittering in her walls that runs to the air vent. She calls the extermination company and talks to a man about the skittering. The man from the other end thinks it's probably rats, and says to give her name and address so he can take care of it. But the lady can't remember due to dementia, so she looks at hanging clippings to tell him her name and address. The exterminator, Frank, reaches the old lady's house in harsh blizzard and sees another exterminator's van parked outside. He thinks someone may be trying to steal his job, so he rushes to the door and tells the lady to buzz him in. While climbing the stairs, Frank sees something oozing out of the air vent outside her flat. He meets up with the lady and talks to her about calling him and the other exterminator both, but the lady can't remember shit. She says, "How can I help you?" And Frank tells, "You hear noises in your walls, right?" The lady can't remember. But at that moment they hear something large skittering in the walls. Frank comes in and follows the sound to the next room, where he finds a blood trail going towards the vents. He turns on his flashlight and peeks into the vent, and sees the other exterminator, all bloodied and asking for help. But suddenly something attacks him from behind, and drags him inside the other room and through the vent. The lady forgets about the incident in an instant, and after hearing another sound, calls another exterminator. We move back 4 days when the real incident starts. A meteor crashes through the atmosphere and breaks into small pieces, crashing through the roof of the old lady's house, and into a miniature dollhouse. A small spider hatches out from the meteor, and takes shelter in the dollhouse. Charlotte, the 12-year-old granddaughter of the old lady, moves through the air vent to her aunt's flat, wanting to steal a doll from the dollhouse, and while taking a picture of the doll, she hears something mimic the notification sound of the phone. She finds the spider crawling on the hand and realizes it made the sound. She hears her aunt coming and puts the spider in a matchbox, and flees through the vent. While moving through the vent, she sees the different types of people living in the apartment, her grandma with her cat and her parrot, a biology student fiddling with his fish, her aunt berating her overworked stepfather, Ethan, to fix the window that the meteor fragment came through. Ethan thinks Charlotte did it and starts coming to her room. Charlotte panics and starts hurriedly go through the vent. She returns just in time, and denies ever going to her aunt's apartment, saying, "I don't play with dolls." Ethan leaves to take a call and Charlotte smiles. Observing the spider, she names it Sting. She puts Sting in a glass jar and takes a picture of it, posting it in Instagram, and Sting mimics the notification whistle again. Charlotte's mother, Heather, calls her to look after her 6-month-old brother while Heather works. Charlotte is grumpy and says to her brother, "You are the bane of my existence. And I thought I had a shitty sister." Later that day, Charlotte was working on her little comic project with the doll and finds a cockroach. Sting makes the whistling sound again, and Charlotte thinks he is hungry. She gives Sting the cockroach, but Sting lets it move around. Charlotte's brother makes a sound and she looks towards her, but when she looks back she sees nothing in the jar. Sting is nowhere to be found, and neither the cockroach. Charlotte flips the jar and sees Sting has webbed up the roach on top of the jar in mere seconds when she wasn't looking. Ethan was fixing the neighbor, Maria's sink, when a cockroach falls on his face. They talk about how life is in the apartment and talks about their children. Maria says, he is lucky to have such beautiful kids. Charlotte in her room catches another cockroach and whistles to the jar. Sting repeats the sound and she gives him the cockroach. This time Sting shoots a web from his brow, like Spider-Man, and takes the cockroach to the top of the jar. Meanwhile, Ethan fixes the boiler in the dark basement and compresses the garbage. Returning to his apartment, he hypes himself up to deal with his family. "Don't we all, Ethan? Don't we all?" He knocks and Heather opens up and hands him the baby, saying she needs to go put Charlotte's grandma in bed. Heather finds her mother and aunt watching TV, and says it's time for bed. Grandma says she made a sweater for Charlotte. Heather is pleased and kisses Grandma's forehead. Grandma says, "You would love to meet my daughter," forgetting Heather is her daughter. Ethan was drawing his comic characters as he has to finish it before the publisher's deadline when his pencil breaks. He doesn't find his sharpener and calls Charlotte to return it. Charlotte comments on his drawings and says, "Why is the evil doctor character based on her real father?" Ethan likes to listen to her input and she says maybe add eyes inside the goggles so that we can see his emotions. Heather watches them bond and smiles, then calls Charlotte to help her make the table for dinner. She thanks Ethan for taking care of Charlotte and Ethan rizzes her up, stealing an ooga dooga, then they finish dinner together. Ethan was finishing his drawing later and removes the eyes that Charlotte drew. Then he hears a noise coming from Charlotte's room. He goes to Charlotte's room but finds there's nobody there. Ethan sees a sketch of a man riding a giant spider, made by Charlotte, and beside that sees the jar, almost halfway covered in webs. But before he can examine it, Charlotte comes and calls him an intruder, but Ethan says he is just here to see if the princess is in bed. Charlotte somersaults into the bed and Ethan says, "God damn it, do you know how much that bed costs?" Charlotte smiles and says Her Majesty will consider getting on the bed gently next time. Ethan puts her to bed, and asks if he can steal the giant spider idea for his book. Charlotte makes a deal with him for chocolates. Ethan says he loves her, and puts her to bed. In the middle of the night, Sting opens the lid of his jar and flees into the air vent. Grandma's parrot hears him moving and starts shouting. But nobody listens. Next morning Ethan, Heather and Charlotte is having breakfast. They are so busy with their work, they don't listen to what Charlotte has to say. Charlotte leaves angrily and Heather asks her to wear Grandma's sweater. But Charlotte doesn't want to because it smells like mothballs. Heather asks Ethan why is she in such a bad mood. Ethan thinks it's because he erased the eyes Charlotte drew in his character, and Ethan thinks she doesn't see him as a perfect dad that her own father was. Heather says her real father never talks to her, never calls and never visits even though he lives just over the bridge. How is he a perfect father? Ethan still isn't convinced, but Heather convinces him saying Charlotte changed everything about her when she met Ethan, and she idolizes him. She's just scared Ethan will leave them like her real father. Ethan thinks they should tell Charlotte about her real father, but Heather thinks she still needs time. Heather and Ethan both get busy working, but right then they hear a blood-curdling scream from upstairs. It's so loud everyone of the apartment hears it. It's Charlotte's aunt. The parrot has been skinned alive and its skin melted. Ethan is shocked seeing it. Who could have done this? Aunt thinks it's rats. She asks Ethan to call the exterminator, Frank. Frank reaches the apartment and examines the bird. He doesn't think it's rats cause rats don't melt their food. Frank sees bloodstains on the air vent. He opens it up and throws a smoke canister into it, to lure the culprit out. Charlotte is watching cat videos on her phone when Sting mimics the cat's meow. Charlotte becomes curious and plays a bird song. Sting mimics it too. Charlotte realizes Sting is a mimic and wanting to do some experiments, brings out a bunch of cockroaches. A mothball rolls out of her sweater and rolls towards Sting's jar. Sting shakes the jar violently and Charlotte takes the mothball away, realizing Sting is scared of the mothball. A mothball is a naphthalene ball with pungent smell, used to keep away bugs. Charlotte touches the ball on one of Sting's web and it immediately melts away. Sting is very agitated and the jar almost rolls off the table, but Charlotte catches it. But while catching it she has a glimpse of Sting. He is huge now, much larger than a small spider. Though Charlotte doesn't mind a big spider as a pet. Frank hoses down the entire apartment with chemicals. While hosing the biology student's room, he talks about how his fish all look scared and the man asks not to disturb the fish. His work is very important to create pancreatic beta cells. Frank jokes about working on big things in a rusty old kitchen, but the student is humorless. Frank finishes his work there and moves on to Ethan's flat. He tries to hose Charlotte's room but she stops him, saying, "Sting won't like it." Frank thinks Sting is her pet cat or something, but Charlotte corrects him. Sting is a spider. Frank thinks a spider is a horrible pet, because they can't love like a dog or a cat can. Charlotte disagrees. Frank wants to see Sting. Charlotte shows him the jar but Frank becomes flustered seeing such a big spider. He takes his payment and leaves. Charlotte catches some roaches and feeds one to Sting. Sting is getting aggressive by the moment. She asks if he wants more and Sting whistles. Charlotte gives him more and goes to sleep. But that big 8-legged monstrosity isn't going to be happy with roaches anymore. He escapes his jar when Charlotte falls asleep. Maria's Pomeranian barks at the air vent, waking Maria. But Sting is far past parrots and dogs. Maria goes to the kitchen and takes a sip of her margarita, and takes a pill from the cabinet, not seeing Sting inside the cabinet. Sting crawls onto her and hides behind her late family's picture. And suddenly jumps and bites her. She falls, and cuts her head. But the bite slowly starts to melt her face. She stands up, goes to the bathroom, and sees her bite mark. She starts to feel dizzy and suddenly becomes paralyzed. Maria falls on the bathtub paralyzed and sees Sting coming into the bathroom. Sting slowly crawls into her mouth. She gags but can't do anything about it. The monster spider moves through her guts and cuts her open from the inside, preparing to devour her. Charlotte is having dinner with her family and asks Ethan if she can buy a fish tank from the biology student Eric downstairs. Ethan says the guy is creepy and he's not right in the mind. He asks Charlotte to stay away from Eric. But Charlotte goes anyway and asks Eric if she can buy one of his fish tanks for her pet spider. Eric asks to see her spider, and Charlotte shows him, and asks if it is okay for spiders to grow twice as fast in a couple of hours. He says it is not possible. Charlotte shows him how Sting can mimic whistles. At that point Eric becomes creeped out himself and says, "Charlotte, this is not a spider." She says it's all right and feeds a cockroach to Sting. Eric sees the spiderweb the roach and realizes it's really nothing like a spider, and offers Charlotte to let him have Sting so that he can find the perfect tank for him, and he will bring the tank and Sting to her. Charlotte wants to stay, but Eric says it's a delicate process and it will take time. He will bring him later. Ethan and Heather are arguing about a new job when they hear something in the vents. Ethan goes to check but gets jumped by Maria's dog, who was rushing towards him. Ethan is confused, he takes the dog and returns it to Maria's flat, but finds Maria's mangled, melted body. The police arrives and questions Ethan about the horrific scene, making him a suspect as the supervisor of the apartment. But right then Eric calls, asking Ethan to come to his flat. Eric shows Ethan the giant spider his daughter is keeping, and he thinks the spider is the killer. Ethan goes and confronts Charlotte about the spider. Charlotte becomes angry and rushes to Eric's apartment. Eric doesn't open, so Charlotte goes back and confronts Ethan, why he would get rid of her pet. She lets all her emotions out. She asks, why did Ethan kill the professor character in his comic book? Is it because he was based on her real dad? Her dad, who is awesome. Ethan loses it and says, if he's so awesome, why doesn't he visit? Charlotte thinks he lives in Thailand, but Ethan says, no, he lives across the bridge, it's a 25-minute drive. Charlotte begins weeping and leaves. Heather and Ethan argue. Heather berates Ethan, but Ethan asks if he is Charlotte's dad or is he not. Heather leaves after Charlotte. Meanwhile Eric keeps feeding Sting every animal in his enclosure. Sting keeps growing. When Eric falls asleep, Sting keeps eating, and soon Sting becomes as big as the tank itself. Sting is ready to eat more, and breaks the tank. Ethan is fixing the heater and becomes frustrated due to the day's incidents. He starts hitting the heater with his wrench, the irony. Aunt Gunnar stops him and says, that's it, no paycheck for you this month. Ethan says, why do you hate me? Gunnar says, I don't hate you, Ethan. You are a nice guy, and like all nice guys you are weak, and you will leave. I am doing everyone here a big favor. Ethan is shocked and stands there for a second. Gunnar tries to find her cat, but it's nowhere. Then suddenly she hears meowing from the vent. She ventures into the vent, listening to the meowing. At that exact moment her flashlight goes out. She tries to fix it, and keeps moving inside the dark. And when her flashlight comes on, she sees big-ass Sting right in front of her. Sting attacks and webs her up, taking her inside the vent. Ethan is trying to fix the TV in their flat, but with all the stress and shouting and noise, becomes agitated. When the cable shocks him, he gets enraged and punches the TV. Heather gives him a piece of her mind while the kids are in the next room. While Heather is saying she can't do this again with Ethan, she sees Sting, massive in size, crawling on the roof. She screams and Sting jumps on Ethan, paralyzing both him and Heather. Sting is dragging both of them away, and Maria's dog is barking. Dumbass Charlotte thinks the dog is hungry. She gets up from her throne, with her phone and headphone barely missing Ethan getting dragged away. She is glued to her phone while getting food for the dog. But he is still barking. Finally Charlotte takes her headphone off, and searches for her mom. But there's nobody anywhere. She looks into the vent and Sting whistles. Sting charges at her, but she puts up a cupboard on the vent. But there's vents all over the house, and her baby brother is taken. Charlotte becomes determined to take Sting down. She remembers Sting hates the mothballs. She wears her grandma's sweater, crushes the mothballs and makes a liquid solution, fills it up into a water gun and enters the vent. She finds the dog, melted and mangled, but pushes through. Ethan is webbed up along with Gunnar, and Gunnar is taken by Sting. Charlotte reaches Eric's flat, and finds him strung and melted up in the ceiling. She goes to her grandma's flat through the vents and finds more mothballs. She makes the solution, dousing her and filling up her gun, says grandma to take care, and heads out. Ethan is struggling in the string and rips his hand out of it, but it slashes his hand. Ethan screams in pain, but Charlotte hears it. Charlotte finds Ethan strung to the vent wall, and asks if he can hang on when she melts the web. Ethan says, he can. Charlotte melts the web with the mothball fluid and Ethan starts to come to the exit. But he suddenly hears baby Liam crying and tries to go for him. Charlotte stops him and moves the light up. They see giant Sting who rushes towards them. They scream and fall into the garbage bin. Sting comes down and bares his fangs to Charlotte. Charlotte is stiff in fear. Ethan takes the bottle filled with mothball water and douses Sting with it. Sting burns up, screams in pain, and flees. Ethan comforts Charlotte and says it's not your fault and they have to do this together. Charlotte says, "Don't leave me." And Ethan says he never will. At that moment Frank, the exterminator, falls through the disposal and tries to steal the last mothball water bottle, but Ethan stops him. Frank says he doesn't need it, he got a nail gun. Frank shoots Sting with it and Sting bleeds blue blood. But the water sprinkler is hit and it starts spraying, washing the mothball water off. Sting attacks Frank and bites his torso off. Ethan and Charlotte flee into the garbage compactor and finds Heather and baby Liam. They melt the web and freeze them. But Sting is coming in. Ethan tries to bring the compactor down but the switch is unplugged. He tries to put the switch in and gets electrocuted. But the switch is on and Charlotte presses the switch and crushes Sting. Sting becomes Pancake and bares his fangs to them. All dead. Heather gives Ethan CPR, and Charlotte finally says to Ethan, "I love you, Dad." But they don't notice. A bunch of eggs stuck to the wall behind them. As Sting wasn't a he, it was a she. Subscribe for more horror, mystery and thriller recaps.